She woke up before the sun did. Hours before the clock even threatened to ring, she had already laid out her clothes, not just any clothes, but the outfit she'd dreamed of wearing on this day for years. A royal blue hat with a matching dress, pressed and perfect, sat on the edge of her bed like a quiet promise. Today, her son, the baby boy she raised on long shifts, skipped meals, and folded prayers, was graduating. Not just from any school, but from one of the toughest military programs in the country. She hadn't missed a single milestone of his life, and she wasn't about to start now. The pride she felt in her chest was heavy, like armor. As she got ready, each item she put on felt symbolic. The pearls weren't just for elegance, they were her mother's. The dress, tailored just right, was the same one she wore when her son left for training. And the heels, though they pinched a little, made her stand tall. She looked at herself in the mirror and didn't see the tired woman from the graveyard shift or the mother who cried quietly on nights her son didn't call. She saw a warrior, too, just of a different kind. She arrived at the venue early, as she always did. She wanted the best seat, one close enough to see his face the moment they called his name. She wanted to catch the exact second his eyes scanned the crowd, and found hers because they always did. Every school play, every science fair, every football game, no matter the noise, his eyes would find hers like they had their own GPS. People filled the auditorium quickly. Families draped in flags, fathers in pressed suits, mothers adjusting their cameras, little siblings squirming in rows. She greeted some politely, smiled at others, but mostly she sat quietly, hands folded, nerves jittering like she was the one about to graduate. It had taken everything in her not to cry during the national anthem. Her son had given 4 years to something bigger than himself, and today was proof it hadn't broken him, it had refined him. And then she saw them, the graduates, lined up tall and proud, filing in like storm clouds with precision in their steps. She found him instantly, even under the uniform, even under the matching caps. It was the way he carried himself, the same way he had when he first learned to walk, arms out like wings. Her heart swelled, and she brought a hand to her lips, trying to catch the emotion before it spilled. She whispered, "That's my baby," under her breath, not for anyone else, just for her. Just to anchor herself in the moment. A hand tapped her shoulder. She turned, still smiling, expecting perhaps another parent or an usher offering a program. Instead, 2 uniformed guards loomed over her, faces unreadable. One pointed to her hat, the other gestured toward the back. She blinked, confused. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out," one said. She stared. "Step out? Why? Your attire isn't compliant with the event dress code. We've had some complaints." She looked around. People were wearing caps, sunglasses, even one woman in a feathered fascinator. She felt a hot flush crawl up her neck, but she kept her voice even. "My hat, this hat. Yes, ma'am, please come with us." Her son was about to be called. Her hands gripped the seat in front of her as if it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. She tried to reason, but their faces stayed blank, the kind of blank that tells you arguing won't help. Around her, the crowd had grown quiet, some watching, some pretending not to. The joy she carried so proudly an hour ago now fought to breathe under the weight of humiliation. She stood slowly, each movement deliberate, head held high. If they were going to walk her out, she'd give them the dignity of walking tall. She smoothed the hem of her dress, adjusted her hat. Her son was still on stage, eyes forward, unaware. She took a step forward, then chairs scraped behind her. Heavy boots thudded against the floor. 6 men in uniform stood in perfect sync, rising like shadows out of sunlight. No words were spoken, but their message was clear. One of the guards stepped slightly closer, his hand resting near his belt as if he expected trouble, though none had been offered. The woman blinked at him, unsure what to say next. She had already explained twice, softly, politely, that she had no idea her hat would be a problem. It wasn't extravagant, just something her sister helped her pick out months ago. A small piece of flair for a moment that only comes once in a lifetime. but the guards didn't seem interested in explanations. They weren't here for understanding. They were here to remove her. That much was clear in their stance, in their clipped words, in the way they looked just over her head rather than into her eyes. One guard pointed again, firmer this time. "Ma'am, I've already asked. I'm going to need you to come with us now." She clutched her purse tightly, resisting the instinct to shrink, to apologize for existing in the way that made others uncomfortable. Her mother had taught her better. Her son, who had trained in silence, who had endured hell to stand on that stage, had never once backed down in the face of pressure. She would not do so now. Her gaze lifted, steady and calm, and for a second one of the guards faltered. Just slightly, but the moment passed. All around them, the crowd shifted in their seats. No one intervened. No one spoke. A few glanced over their shoulders, but most stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the stage, as if pretending not to see would make the discomfort go away. It always went like this: a woman too proud, a tone too direct, an outfit too bold. The margins for presence were always thinner for some. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't resisting. She was simply sitting where she was supposed to be, wearing something that dared to make her feel beautiful. Still, they wanted her gone. The younger of the two guards looked slightly embarrassed, as if he realized how this might appear from the outside. But instead of speaking up, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the exit. The older one kept his voice clipped dry as concrete. "This is your final warning, ma'am." She glanced one more time toward the stage, searching for her son in the line of graduates. He hadn't looked her way yet. She didn't want him to see this, not because she was ashamed of herself, but because she knew what it would do to him. He was the kind of man who took things personally when someone disrespected his family. He'd been like that since he was small, rushing in when his cousins teased her, jumping between her and stray dogs, stepping in front of her like a shield without being asked. Now, here she stood, alone and surrounded by people pretending this was normal. She exhaled slowly, stood taller, and turned toward the aisle. One slow step, then another. Her heels echoed on the polished floor, too loud in the sudden silence. A few people in the row behind her glanced down, pretending to be interested in their programs. One woman, older, clutched her purse like it might fly away. No one offered a word. No one asked a question. The security guard followed 2 steps behind, close enough to signal control, but not enough to touch her. She didn't need to look back to know he was there. She could feel it, like heat on the back of her neck. She thought about all the times she had told her son to ignore things like this. "Keep your head up," she used to say. "Don't let them see they've gotten to you." She had said it through tears some nights, when he came home with bruises he wouldn't explain. And now here she was, repeating the same advice to herself, blinking slowly so the sting in her eyes wouldn't betray her. When they reached the edge of the seating area, she paused. The graduation ceremony had continued, but now it felt like it was happening in another world. The applause, the names being called, the speeches, it all seemed distant. She turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the stage again. Her son still hadn't seen her, and for a moment she hoped he wouldn't. Maybe she could step out and return before he noticed. Maybe she could explain it all away later. Maybe this moment could still belong to him. Maybe this wouldn't be the story they remembered when they thought about this day. The air felt thick, as though the oxygen in the room had shifted somehow. The moment she stepped into the aisle, flanked by the silent insistence of the guards, something in the atmosphere changed. It was small at first, a slight murmur, the faint scraping of shoes as a few people shifted in their seats, but it grew quickly. The ceremony continued on stage, but down in the crowd, eyes were beginning to turn. Some were subtle, quick glances cast sideways like shadows flickering across walls. Others stared openly now, their expressions ranging from confusion to quiet unease. Still, no one said a word. The silence was a verdict in itself. Rows of families lined the auditorium, all dressed in their Sunday best, phones in hand, programs folded neatly on their laps. Everyone had come for the same purpose, to witness a moment of pride, a milestone earned. But now, the narrative had bent slightly, taking on a different shape. In a sea of cheers and applause, this one woman had become an interruption, a ripple in the carefully choreographed stillness. And while the guards maintained their professional calm, their presence next to her was loud in its own way. It said, "This one is different. This one doesn't belong." She felt their stares, some sharp like blades, others pitying, which somehow felt worse. She didn't need sympathy. She didn't want it. All she had done was show up, like every other mother in the room. All she had done was dress in a way that reflected how important this day was to her. But the rules, unspoken and shifting, were always applied more heavily when it came to her. The guards said nothing now, their silence a wall between her and the crowd. Their presence alone was a signal, a quiet declaration that they had the authority, and she had none. There were no sirens, no harsh voices, no shouting, but the weight of humiliation pressed down harder than if there had been. She wasn't being dragged out, no, but being escorted out can be just as loud when everyone is watching and no one is speaking. Up ahead, the exit sign glowed red. It seemed to pulse with each step she took, getting closer, brighter, more final. She could hear the faint crackle of the microphone on stage. Another name was called. Another round of applause. None of it reached her fully. She was moving through a different kind of space now, one carved out by discomfort and silence, one where the path in front of her seemed to stretch farther than it was. Then, from somewhere near the center rows there was movement, not the casual kind, not the sort that came from boredom or shifting to find a better view. This was deliberate, purposeful. She caught it out of the corner of her eye, a row of men rising in near-perfect sync. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The sound of their chairs sliding back, the sheer presence of them standing together, drew more attention than the guards had. People started turning their heads for real now, conversations flickering on the edges of their lips, whispers running down the rows like electricity. The men were all in uniform, not suits, not dress shirts, but military uniforms, sharp, dark, the kind that came with rank and weight. They stood shoulder to shoulder, and without so much as a glance at one another, they stepped out from their row into the aisle. The guards paused. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but they both halted their steps, uncertain for the first time since the confrontation began. One of them turned slightly, eyes narrowing as he registered what was happening. The other kept his eyes on the woman, but his posture shifted. The room seemed to realign itself. Where moments ago she was walking alone in the shadow of authority, she was now walking in the company of something else entirely. People sat up straighter. Some whispered to those beside them. A few began recording, phones rising quietly from laps and bags. The silence was still there, but now it buzzed with a different energy. No one had shouted, no fists had been raised, but the presence of those men, standing there like statues with breath, disrupted the story that had begun to write itself. The image of a woman being quietly removed from her own child's celebration no longer stood unchallenged. The balance of power shifted, not with confrontation, but with unity. They didn't speak for her. They stood with her, and that was louder than anything the guards could have said. The guard's posture changed in that almost imperceptible way that only trained eyes could catch, a slight stiffening of the shoulders, a half step back instead of forward, the brief flicker of uncertainty that passed through their gaze before they masked it again. The woman didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The 6 men now standing just yards from her filled the space with a presence that words couldn't compete with. Not flashy, not aggressive, but unmistakably authoritative. They wore the kind of uniform that didn't require explanation. Each ribbon, each badge, each line of stitching told its own story. These weren't just men in uniform. These were warriors, and everyone in the room knew it. They didn't rush forward or demand attention. They simply stood solid, calm, and completely focused on her. She turned, her eyes meeting theirs, and in that instant, a quiet understanding passed between them. These were her son's people, his brothers, the ones he had gone through fire with. She had never met them before, but she had heard their names, seen their faces in photos. felt their stories through the voice of her son during late-night phone calls when he could finally speak again. They started moving, slow, deliberate steps down the aisle, forming a line between her and the guards without touching anyone, without speaking. It wasn't a blockade. It was something more powerful than that, a shield built from respect, forged in loyalty. Their steps synchronized like they were still on a mission, every movement practiced, instinctive. The room had quieted even more, if that were possible. The applause from the stage had faded awkwardly, and though the graduation announcer tried to push forward, the energy in the space refused to be pulled away. All eyes had shifted now, the invisible spotlight moving off the stage and down into the center aisle. Cameras were up, mouths slightly open, as everyone watched the quiet protest unfold. One of the guards, the older one, tried to recover the authority he'd wielded just moments ago. "Sirs," he said, his voice lower now, less sure, "we're handling a situation here." But the SEALs didn't flinch. They didn't raise their voices or posture. They didn't need to. The lead man, a tall figure with weathered eyes and a square jaw, simply looked at the woman, then back at the guard. His meaning was crystal clear. She is not alone. There are moments in life when silence carries more power than all the speeches in the world. This was one of them. No raised fists, no shouting, no slogans or signs, just presence. Unshakable, dignified presence. The guard stood on one side, still trying to enforce rules that now felt suddenly hollow. On the other side stood 6 men who had bled for the flag embroidered on their chests, staring down 2 men trying to humiliate a mother on the day her child rose to join their ranks. For a moment, it wasn't clear what would happen next. The tension sat heavy in the room, a coin spinning in midair, undecided. Then the younger guard looked to the older one, his face uncertain. The older one's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. He scanned the uniforms in front of him again, not just the fabric, but what it meant, the discipline, the sacrifice, the code, and the weight of it all began to settle into his stance. Still no one moved. The woman stood between them, her eyes wet but unbowed. The men around her weren't asking for anything. They weren't demanding. They were witnessing. They were standing. And by doing so, they were saying what too many in that room hadn't found the courage to. Others began to shift now, not the men in uniform, but the audience. Mothers leaned forward. Fathers adjusted their ties. Someone near the back muttered something to a neighbor, not quite loud enough to be heard. One by one, the spectators began to sit up straighter, as if realizing they, too, had been part of something shameful by doing nothing. Something about those 6 standing men made inaction feel like complicity. The woman looked forward again, her chin high. Her son was still on the stage, still waiting for his name to be called. The ceremony had slowed but hadn't stopped. In the distance, another name echoed through the speakers, but the room's true focus remained here. On the woman who had come to see her son graduate, on the guards who had tried to deny her that moment, and on the silent wall of brothers who had risen not just for their teammate's mother, but for something deeper, something bigger than a dress code or a power trip the moment they stepped in front of her. It became clear that this wasn't just about a hat or a dress code or some arbitrary guideline printed in fine print at the bottom of a program. It wasn't about rules anymore, not really. It was about dignity. It was about respect. And these men weren't asking for it, they were ensuring it. The guards didn't move, but their confidence had slipped like mist after sunrise. Their badges still gleamed, but their stance no longer held the same weight. Facing them now were 6 men trained to move through fire and return with the mission complete, and their mission now was silent, unshakable solidarity. The woman's back remained straight. Her eyes stayed on her son in the distance, but her awareness of what was happening around her was sharp. She didn't flinch when the men surrounded her in a subtle arc. They didn't touch her, they didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to shift the dynamic entirely. The crowd that once avoided her gaze now stared openly. Whatever the audience had assumed about her before, that she was disruptive, inappropriate, perhaps that lens cracked under the gravity of what they were witnessing now. One of the SEALs, his posture impossibly calm, glanced at the older guard and then to the younger. Nothing threatening in his expression, just a look, steady and grounded, like he was waiting for them to realize they'd gone too far. He didn't speak. None of them did, but they didn't have to. Their uniforms did the talking. Their presence was a reminder not just of who they were, but of who they stood for. She was not just a guest in that building. She was the mother of one of their own, and if she was being disrespected, so were they. The older guard adjusted his stance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hand dropped away from his belt, no longer trying to signal control. He looked at her again, really looked, and something in his expression flickered. Maybe it was shame, maybe it was realization. Whatever it was, it arrived too late to be useful. The moment had already spoken, the crowd had already seen, the 6 men had already made their position unshakably clear. Still, the woman didn't speak. She didn't need to defend herself or argue. Everything about her, from her poise to the pain in her eyes, from the quiet resolve in her shoulders to the stillness in her breath, said more than words ever could. She had already been through far worse than this. She had already carried her son through years of sacrifice, doubt, and pride. She had done the work. She had earned this moment, and she wasn't going to be pushed aside by a misplaced sense of authority. The graduates on the stage were beginning to notice too. Heads turned. A few of them leaned slightly to get a better look at what was happening in the crowd. They saw the line of uniforms. They saw the guards standing awkwardly nearby. They saw the mother, unmoving, regal in her stillness. Some of them, not all but enough, began to understand the story unfolding in the seats below them. This wasn't a disturbance. This was protection. This was a wall formed not from conflict, but from honor. Some in the crowd started to nod slowly. A few murmurs rose and fell, none hostile. The energy in the room shifted further, the current of opinion bending around the woman now, no longer avoiding her. She wasn't being removed. She was being guarded, and not by force, but by loyalty. Loyalty that can only be built between people who have shared things most will never understand. Her son had shared that bond with these men. Now they shared it with her. One of the women, a few rows back, lowered her phone as if suddenly unsure whether recording this was right anymore. This didn't feel like something that belonged on the internet. This felt sacred. Unfolding in real time was a correction of something that had gone wrong in the quiet, casual way that most wrongs do. A look, a policy, a choice disguised as procedure. But now, that wrong had met its resistance. Not through confrontation, not through shouts or protests, but through a silent recalibration of power and presence. The younger guard's eyes darted from one uniform to the next. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then turned his eyes downward. The older one exhaled quietly through his nose, stepping slightly back, as though giving the moment back to her without saying a word. The woman didn't acknowledge them. Her focus was ahead, where her son was now stepping forward on the stage, his name about to be called, his eyes scanning the crowd, the spotlight. Time seemed to slow. His boots hit the stage with a quiet authority that matched the 6 men standing below. He moved with the kind of discipline that doesn't come from natural talent, but from enduring discomfort, from pushing through exhaustion, from wanting something so badly that failure becomes a language you no longer speak. His name rang through the speakers, clean and clear, and in that moment he didn't hesitate. His eyes searched the crowd, not for applause, not for cameras, but for her. He spotted her before anyone else. The flash of blue from her hat still visible behind the wall of uniforms now stationed like sentinels in the aisle. For a split second, confusion passed over his face. She was standing. She was surrounded. She was not where she should have been, but then he saw them, his brothers, and just like that he understood. He didn't need a full explanation. He had spent enough time with these men to know that they didn't rise without reason. If they were standing beside his mother, then something had happened that demanded it. And if something had happened, then she had stood alone until they decided she wouldn't. He nodded once, not to her, not to the crowd, but to the 6 men who had stepped up. It was barely a movement, but they saw it, because they had been trained to notice everything. The salute wasn't required, the thank you didn't need to be said, they had answered a call that hadn't been spoken. That was how they worked, that was who they were. The audience began to shift again, this time in a way that felt different. A quiet respect began to fall over the room, not the loud, clapping kind that bursts from pride, but a slower, more reverent kind. The kind that happens when people recognize they've just seen something that will stick with them longer than the names read aloud or the medals handed out. The ceremony continued, but now it had depth, a new layer added not by the officials on stage, but by a mother in blue and the 6 figures who refused to let her stand alone. Even the other graduates took notice. As they waited for their names to be called, more of them turned to catch a glimpse of her. They had been trained to focus forward, to stay sharp and still, but discipline doesn't erase humanity. They saw what everyone else saw. A mother who had been singled out, who had faced quiet disrespect wrapped in official tone, and who had been answered not with apology, but with a silent army of loyalty. Her son accepted his certificate and turned to face the crowd. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he looked straight at her, eyes locked like they had in childhood, back when he used to glance from the field to find her in the bleachers. The distance between them felt small now. So much had been said without a single word. She had fought battles for him when he couldn't. Today, someone had fought one for her. One of the men who stood with her shifted slightly, not breaking formation, but offering her just enough space to move. She didn't walk forward. She didn't need to. The message had been sent and received. The damage, the attempt to shame her, had been answered in full. She stood tall, watching her son reclaim the day that nearly slipped away. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with a calm kind of victory that comes from knowing you never lowered your head when it mattered most. Parents in the crowd began to nod quietly. A few murmured words to their children beside them. Some with daughters, some with sons, all suddenly aware of how fragile dignity could be in public space, how easily it could be taken, and how powerful it is to see it restored. The energy had shifted. The crowd wasn't just watching a graduation anymore. They were watching a correction, a moment when the balance tipped the other way. Her son stepped off the stage, his boots hitting the final step like punctuation. The 6 men remained in place, still at attention. No medals on their chests could compare to what they had just done. No ceremony more meaningful than the one that unfolded in silence. Their mission had changed the room. Not with speeches, not with orders, but with presence, with a refusal to let disrespect go unanswered, with a decision to stand when it would have been easier to sit. And in the quiet that followed, it was clear that everyone understood what they had witnessed: a mother's pride protected, a soldier's respect repaid, a room reminded that silence does not always mean peace, and presence does not always require permission.